The soldier's fingers found her wrist before anyone else could move. His grip was weak, barely anything, but his eyes were locked onto her face with a clarity that didn't belong to a man who'd lost that much blood. The trauma room was full of people, doctors, nurses, federal agents in tactical gear still wearing their dust, all of them watching. And out of every face in that room, the dying operator had found hers. His lips barely moved. "Major." A breath. A pause. "You're here." Nobody spoke. The monitors kept screaming. Blood was still pooling beneath the gurney, soaking through the paper sheet, dripping in a slow rhythm onto the tile floor. And Claire Donovan, the nurse everyone at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center had spent the last 2 years treating like furniture, stood completely still while the entire room tried to understand what they'd just witnessed. 2 seconds ago, she'd been shoved against the wall and told to hand out gauze. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where I want you. Follow along until the very end, hit like if Claire deserves her moment, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hargrove Memorial Medical Center sat at the edge of Dellfield, Colorado, where the Front Range started to flatten and the winters came early and stayed too long. It was a Level 2 trauma center, not the biggest in the state, not the best funded, but busy enough that the staff ran on caffeine and resentment in roughly equal measure. The kind of hospital where the hierarchy wasn't posted anywhere official, but everybody knew it, felt it, enforced it without being asked. Claire Donovan had worked the overnight trauma floor for 22 months. She'd transferred in from a contract position in Montana, given a vague employment history, and kept almost entirely to herself. She was 33 years old, medium height, the kind of plain that people forgot immediately after looking at her. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight, kept her sleeves rolled down even in summer, and spoke in complete sentences only when she had something worth saying, which most of her coworkers interpreted as either stupidity or arrogance, depending on their mood. The truth was simpler. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixed. Her supervisor was a woman named Margaret Holt, head of nursing for the ER, 15 years in the role. The type who'd long ago confused seniority with competence and authority with intelligence. Margaret ran her floor with a specific kind of efficiency. She identified the nurses least likely to push back and piled the worst assignments onto them. Night shifts, holiday coverage, the patients nobody wanted, the documentation that took 4 hours when done correctly. Claire got all of it. "Donovan," Margaret's voice carried across the nurse's station without her even raising it. That flat, particular tone she used when she wanted something done immediately and resented having to ask at all. "Room 7 needs a full intake, and someone's going to have to stay over to cover the 6 a.m. gap because Walsh called out again." "I'm already on until 5:30, Claire said. "I know what your schedule says." A beat. Claire looked at her. Margaret looked back with the expression of a woman who had never once in her professional life lost a staring contest. "I'll cover the gap," Claire said. "Good." Margaret had already looked back at her tablet. "Also, the supply closet on the East Wing needs a full inventory count before morning rounds. Somebody has to do it." Across the station, one of the newer nurses, a 26-year-old named Becca, who'd been at Hargrove 8 months and had already figured out the social architecture, caught Claire's eye and gave her a microscopic look of sympathy. Claire didn't return it. Sympathy was fine. It didn't change anything. The resident who made Claire's nights actively worse was named Dr. Kyle Reeves. He was 29, second year, and had the specific brand of confidence that came not from being good, but from never having been seriously wrong in front of someone who mattered. He was smart enough to be dangerous and experienced enough to think that meant something. He'd grown up being told he was exceptional, and Hargrove Memorial hadn't yet given him a serious reason to doubt it. He'd decided early on that Claire was beneath his notice, which meant he mostly interacted with her by talking through her. "Somebody get me a tox panel on the patient in 4, he'd say, standing directly in front of her. Not her name. Not a direct request. Just an announcement made to the air, trusting that the appropriate nobody would handle it. Or he'd correct her in front of patients. Not because she was wrong, she was almost never wrong, but because correcting her was a way of demonstrating something to whoever else was in the room. He'd adjust the drip rate she'd already set correctly and explain, with patient condescension, why her calculation had been off. It hadn't been. But the patient didn't know that, and neither did the medical student standing in the corner trying to look competent. "You've been a nurse how long?" he'd asked her once, genuinely curious in the way that was also dismissive. "Because your clinical instincts are, they're not bad. You're careful, which is fine for routine stuff, but in a real emergency, you need to move faster than careful." She hadn't answered him. "That's what I mean," he'd said to someone else who wasn't there. "No self-advocacy. You've got to be able to speak up in this environment." Claire had charted the patient's updated vitals and moved to the next room, the shift she'd been working the night. Everything changed had started badly before it started. She'd slept 3 hours between her previous overnight and the current one, gotten a parking ticket on her way in because the staff lot was full, and she'd had to park on the street and arrived to find that the patient assignment board had her down for 6 patients, 2 more than protocol recommended for a solo overnight nurse. She hadn't said anything about the assignments. She'd looked at the board, done the math on what it would take to manage 6 patients safely, and started at one end. Room 1 was a 68-year-old man with a hypertensive crisis who kept insisting he felt fine and demanding to know when he could leave. Room 2 was a teenager with a suspected spinal injury still waiting on imaging. Room 3 was a woman in her 50s with diabetic ketoacidosis who was scared and wanted someone to sit with her and explain things, which was the part of nursing Claire was actually good at, the part nobody ever noticed. She sat for 4 minutes, not long, she couldn't afford long, and explained what was happening in the woman's body in plain, honest language, and watched the woman's shoulders come down from around her ears. "You'll be okay," Claire told her. "The numbers are moving the right direction." "You sure?" "Yes." Not reassurance as noise, as fact. She was on her way to room 5 when Margaret appeared at the end of the corridor with the expression she wore when something was about to become Claire's problem. "We've got a multi-vehicle coming in. 4 patients, ETA 11 minutes. Reeves is taking lead." "How bad?" "2 critical. 1's pediatric." Claire felt the familiar compression in her chest. Not panic. Something more structural than panic. The way a building responds to load. She recalibrated. "I'll clear room 6 and set up for the pediatric." "I've got Yamaoka on the pediatric." "Yamaoka's been on since 7 this morning. She's exhausted." "Yamaoka is assigned to pediatric," Margaret said, and walked away. Claire stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went to find Yamaoka. Sarah Yamaoka was 24 years old, a year out of nursing school, and she was sitting in the break room with her hands flat on the table and her face doing the thing faces do when someone is trying very hard not to cry in a professional setting. "Hey," Claire sat across from her. "What's your patient load right now?" 3. Sarah looked up. "But 2 of them are... Give me one of them. Which one needs the most attention?" "Mr. Ferraro in 9. He's been spiking and his family keeps asking questions and I don't have the right answers yet because I haven't had time to talk." "I'll take 9, Claire said. "You focus on the pediatric from the incoming. You've got good hands, Sarah. You just need to not be running 7 directions at once." Sarah stared at her. Margaret's going to be managing 4 incoming traumas. She won't notice for an hour, and by then the decisions will be made." Claire stood. "Room 9. Got it." It was a small thing. The kind of management that happened below the level of official notice. The kind that didn't get charted or credited or mentioned in any review. Claire had been doing it for 22 months. The multi-vehicle came in loud and fast, the way they always did. Radios crackling, the automatic doors slamming open, gurneys moving with that controlled urgency that was barely controlled at all. Kyle Reeves was already in his element, calling out orders in the clipped shorthand of someone who'd watched enough television about doctors to know what that was supposed to sound like. The 2 critical patients were a 51-year-old man with a suspected splenic laceration and a 17-year-old with a head injury that had stopped being stable somewhere between the accident site and the hospital doors. Claire was technically assigned to supply coordination for the incoming, which meant she was in the room, but not at the table. Margaret's architecture again. Keep her useful, but peripheral. She watched Reeves work the adult patient and clocked 3 things in rapid succession. He'd missed a notation in the paramedic handoff. The patient's blood pressure was trending in a direction that didn't match what he was treating for, and his drip rate was going to cause a problem in approximately 8 minutes. She said nothing. It wasn't her place. She was handing out supplies. 7 minutes later, when the problem announced itself in the form of a sudden BP crash that sent Reeves grabbing for the crash cart, Claire was already at the patient's side with the correct adjustment calculated and the setup ready. "What are you?" Reeves started. His pressure dropped because of the rate, not the injury. "You need to back it off and push fluids." His output numbers in the field were, "I have his numbers." "Then you know the field BP was artificially elevated from the EP they gave on scene." It masked, "I said I have his numbers." His voice had gone flat and very deliberate, which was a different register from his usual condescension. This one had an edge under it. "Step back." She stepped back. He did, 30 seconds later, almost exactly what she'd described. The patient stabilized. Reeves didn't look at her again for the rest of the resuscitation. Afterward, Margaret found Claire restocking supplies in the hallway. "Reeves says you interfered with his patient management." "I offered a clinical observation." "He says you contradicted him in front of staff." "I said what I thought was happening. He made his own call." Claire set down the bag she was carrying. "The patient is stable." "That's not the point." "What is the point?" Margaret's expression shifted, just slightly, the tiniest adjustment of someone recalibrating how hard they want to push. "The point is that there's a chain of command in this ER, and your position in that chain is, I know where I am. Then act like it." A pause. "And you're on documentation duty for the rest of the shift, all incoming charts." Documentation duty was what Margaret assigned when she wanted to make sure someone was buried at a desk and out of her way. It wasn't a punishment with an official name. It didn't need one. Claire sat down at the workstation and started charting. It was 2:14 a.m. when the federal notification came through. She knew it was federal because of the sequence. First, a call to the charge desk that went to Margaret directly, then a drop in the usual ambient noise of the ER as Margaret's voice changed register, and then two things happening almost simultaneously: the overhead announcement of an inbound trauma, priority level maximum, and a pair of men in dark tactical clothing appearing at the ER entrance before the announcement had finished. They weren't hospital security. Their gear was wrong, and their posture was wrong, and the way they moved through the space, not looking for direction, already knowing where they were going, marked them as something else entirely. Margaret materialized at Claire's workstation. "We've got a GSW, blast injury, coming in from a federal operation. Single patient, male, 30s, status critical." She was reading from her phone, voice tight. "Joint federal escort. They'll want a clean room and a limited team." "Who's taking it?" "Reeves is on. I'll assist." She hesitated. "You'll be in the room for supply management." Supply management. Again. "Understood," Claire said. She stood up from the desk and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A specific shift in her internal weather, like pressure dropping before a storm. She'd learned over years of work that had nothing to do with Hargrove Memorial to pay attention to that feeling. She rolled her sleeves down as she walked. The patient arrived in a velocity that silenced the room before anyone saw him clearly. 2 federal agents moving the gurney, 2 more flanking, 1 at the door. The man on the table was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that suggested a physical life, and the kind of damage that suggested something catastrophic had happened to that life very recently. His left side was wrapped in field dressings already soaked through. His face was gray. His breathing was audible from across the room. Reeves moved in immediately, clinical and authoritative, already calling for a pressure cuff and stats. Margaret took her position. Claire moved to the supply station on the east wall and began laying out materials in the order they'd likely be needed, running the differential in her head before anyone asked her to. Blast injury, left thorax. Field compression applied, too long ago, by the look of the dressings. Respirations labored, asymmetric. Left side wasn't moving right. She had the chest tube set up organized before Reeves called for it. "Pressure's dropping," someone said. "I can see that," Reeves said. "Sats are—" "I see the sats." There was a specific silence that filled trauma rooms when a physician was navigating the gap between what they knew how to do and what the situation was actually asking for. Claire had worked in enough of those rooms to recognize it within seconds. It wasn't panic. It was something more dangerous than panic. It was controlled behavior that was running out of the competence needed to sustain it. She watched Reeves's hands. She watched the patient's chest. The left side wasn't moving at all. "He's got a tension pneumo," she said. It came out quiet and flat, not urgent the way you said things when you needed them to land cleanly. "Left side. You need to decompress now." "I'm aware of the differential. His trachea is deviating. You can see it." She was already moving from the supply wall. "If you wait for imaging, he's going to arrest." "Donovan?" Margaret's voice, a warning. "He's going to arrest in approximately 90 seconds if that tension isn't relieved," Claire said. She wasn't at the supply wall anymore. She was at the bedside. "I need a 14-gauge needle, and I need it right now." One of the agents near the door said something under his breath. The patient's hand moved. It was a small movement, just his fingers, just a few inches. But it was deliberate. His head turned toward her. His eyes found her face with an effort that must have cost him something. His mouth moved. She leaned in because she had to, because she couldn't hear him over the monitor alarms. And what he said into the 5 inches between his lips and her ear was not her name. It was her rank. Major. Barely a sound. "You're here." She pulled back and looked at him. His face was different up close, familiar, in the way that combat faces sometimes became familiar, specific, and worn in ways that civilian faces weren't. Sergeant Dale Pruitt. 18 months ago, a forward operating base at altitude, a resupply mission that went sideways, 2 hours of improvised trauma surgery in a room that had once been a storage shed. She hadn't thought about that night in a long time. She'd been working very hard at not thinking about it. "I'm here," she said. Then she picked up the needle and she did not wait for permission. The decompression was textbook. Needle into the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the immediate hiss of trapped air releasing, and then, almost instantaneously, the change in the room. The monitors shifted. The SATs began climbing. The patient's color moved from gray toward something with more life in it. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Kyle Reeves said, in a voice that had lost all of its usual architecture, "What did you just do?" "Tension pneumothorax," Claire said. "I decompressed it." She was already picking up the chest tube setup. "He needs a tube now while we have a window. I need someone on suction." "You don't have authorization to but someone get on suction," she said to the room. One of the nurses, not Margaret, someone younger, someone who'd been watching, moved to suction. The chest tube went in with the precision of someone who had done this in conditions that made a fully equipped ER look like a dream. The patient gasped once, deeply, and then his breathing evening out was a sound that took 10 years off the tension in the room. Margaret's voice came from somewhere behind her. "Security, get security in here." And one of the federal agents, the one closest to the door, turned and looked at Margaret with an expression that stopped her mid-sentence. "Ma'am," he said, very quietly. "I'd hold off on that." He was looking at Claire when he said it, and so was every other agent in the room. The agent didn't move from the doorway. He didn't reach for anything. He just stood there with his arms loose at his sides and looked at Margaret Holt with the specific patience of a man who had been trained to de-escalate situations that were significantly more dangerous than a hospital administrator, and Margaret, who had spent 15 years never once being looked at that way, didn't know what to do with it. She opened her mouth. "I said, and I heard you," the agent said. His voice was the same temperature it had been before. "But right now the priority is the patient. Everything else waits." Margaret looked at the other agents. None of them were looking at her. They were watching Claire work, and the way they were watching her was not the way people watched a nurse doing a procedure. It was something else, a specific quality of attention that Margaret couldn't name and couldn't dismiss. Kyle Reeves hadn't said anything in 90 seconds. He was standing at the foot of the gurney with his hands at his sides, watching Claire suture the chest tube entry point with a technique he didn't recognize from any rotation he'd done, and the expression on his face was the particular blankness of someone whose internal framework had just been handed information it couldn't process. The patient's stats were climbing. Oxygen saturation, 74, then 81, then 88, moving with the slow certainty of someone coming back from a distance. Heart rate steadying, blood pressure still low but no longer in free fall. Claire worked without narrating it. That was the thing Reeves would think about later, in the quiet of the on-call room when he was trying to reconstruct the sequence. She didn't announce what she was doing. No procedural commentary, no calling out steps for the benefit of the room. She just did it. The way people did things they'd done so many times that the actions had moved below the level of thought into something more like reflex, more like muscle, and all the talking she did was directed at the patient. "You still with me, Sergeant?" His eyes moved toward her. Not all the way. He didn't have the energy to turn his head, but the eyes moved. "Good," she said. "Keep doing that." One of the younger nurses, Tomas, who had been at Hargrove 14 months and was standing near the back of the room because nobody had told him where to be, found himself taking a step forward without deciding to. He caught himself, stopped, looked at Margaret for direction. Margaret was staring at Claire's hands. "Pressure's coming up," someone called. "I see it," Claire said. "Someone get me a repeat CBC and I need a surgical consult on standby. He's got internal bleeding we haven't addressed yet. The blast injury is more than the pneumo. His abdomen is rigid on the left side." "You don't," Reeves started, and then stopped because he put his hand on the patient's abdomen where Claire had indicated, and what he felt there stopped the sentence before it finished. He looked up at her. She was already looking at him. "Yeah," she said, simply. Not vindicated, not waiting to be thanked, just confirming the shared fact. Reeves pulled his hand back. "Get me surgical," he said to the room. "Now." It was the right call, finally. Claire moved aside and let him take it, because that was the correct thing to do. Get the physician back in the lead before the situation became about something other than the patient. And this patient needed surgery that was going to require a physician's hands and a physician's authority. And she'd done what she'd needed to do. She stepped back toward the supply station and started breaking down the materials she no longer needed, hands moving automatically. The federal agent near the door watched her do this. His name was Harwick. She'd catch it later, on a badge. And he was roughly 40, with the kind of face that had been outdoors a long time in variable conditions. He didn't say anything. He just watched her step back from the center of the room and resume her position at the periphery and file that observation somewhere. The surgical team arrived 7 minutes later. The patient went upstairs in 11. And then the room was just a room again. Bloody gloves on the floor, monitors going quiet, the particular deflation that followed a trauma resuscitation like a weather change. People started moving. Someone began cleanup. The agents regrouped near the door in a cluster that didn't include anyone from the hospital, speaking in voices too low to reach the nursing station. Margaret Holt stood in the middle of the room and looked at Claire. "My office," she said. "Now." Took them. The office was a 10 by 12 room off the main corridor that smelled like old coffee and the specific kind of stress that accumulated in administrative furniture over years. Margaret shut the door behind them and didn't offer Claire a seat, which Claire didn't need, and stood behind her desk with her arms crossed and her expression doing the thing it did when she was building toward something she'd already decided. "What you did in there saved his life," Claire said. "What you did in there was an unauthorized procedure performed by a nurse without physician approval in a federally monitored trauma situation." Margaret's voice was controlled, deliberate, the way it got when she was documenting something in her head as she said it. "You touched a patient who was under active physician management. You inserted a chest tube without..." The physician was not acting. The patient had 90 seconds. That is not your determination to make. It became my determination when nobody else was making it. Margaret's jaw tightened. "You've had this problem since you started here. This inability to understand your role, you think because you've been a nurse for however long, you've got the standing to override physician judgment in my ER. I didn't override anything. I intervened in a delay." "You contradicted Dr. Reeves in front of federal personnel." Her voice went up slightly, just a degree. "Do you understand what that looks like? Do you understand the liability? The patient is alive." "The patient..." Margaret stopped, recalibrated. When she spoke again, her voice had come back down, which was somehow worse. "The patient's outcome doesn't retroactively authorize what you did. That's not how this works. You know that. Claire looked at her. She'd had some version of this conversation before. In different rooms, with different people who occupied positions of authority they were using incorrectly. The anger in her chest was real, but it was old, and she'd learned a long time ago that expressing it accomplished nothing in this specific kind of exchange. "Are you suspending me?" she asked. "I'm documenting this incident, and I'm recommending a formal review." Margaret sat down. "For now, you're off patient contact. You'll finish the shift on administrative duties. The floor is short 2 nurses. That's being managed." "It's not being managed, Margaret. Sarah Yamaoka has been on 16 hours. I said it's being managed." Final. Closed. "You're dismissed." Claire left. In the hallway, she stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling and breathed. The adrenaline was still in her system. It took longer to clear than people thought always had, and underneath it was something else, something that had been quiet for a long time and was now making noise again. She pressed it back down, picked up her tablet, went to the documentation station and started pulling charts. Tomas found her there 40 minutes later. He was 26 and had the slightly overwhelmed quality of someone who'd come into nursing with genuine idealism and was still working out what to do with the parts of the job that didn't match what he'd imagined. He put a cup of coffee on the desk next to her without saying anything, and then stood there. "You don't have to do that," she said, without looking up. "It's just coffee." "I know what it is." He sat down in the chair across from her. "What you did in there, don't." "I'm not going to, He stopped. Tried again. "I've been here over a year and I've never seen anyone move like that. Like you knew exactly what was going to happen before it happened." She kept charting. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. She didn't answer. After a moment, she said, "Go check on the woman in room 3. Her potassium should have been rechecked 40 minutes ago." He went. She sat with the documentation and the coffee and the particular silence of a hospital at 3 in the morning, which was not peaceful silence, but the silence of held breath, of things suspended between one state and another. She thought about Dale Pruitt being wheeled into a surgical suite upstairs. She thought about the last time she'd seen him, the forward operating base, the storage shed, the sound of rotors. She thought about the rank he'd called her. She'd left that rank behind deliberately, carefully, with the specific intent of leaving it where she couldn't reach it anymore. She thought about how he'd found her face in a room full of people. She pulled the next chart and started typing. Oh, it was 4:40 a.m. when Agent Harwick appeared at the documentation station. He didn't announce himself or ask permission to sit. He just moved a chair and sat in it and put a card on the desk face down the way people put cards down when they want you to know the card exists without making the moment about the card. "How's he doing?" Claire asked. "Surgery's still going, but the early read is good." A pause. "Because of what you did." It was a standard decompression. It was a standard decompression done by someone who recognized a tension pneumothorax correctly and moved on it before the window closed. He looked at her steadily. The physician in the room did not do those things. Claire didn't respond to that. "We ran your credentials when the unit came in," Harwick said. "Standard protocol. We pull names of all personnel who will be in contact with our people." She went still. He was watching her. "The Hargrove Memorial file on you is pretty thin. Montana before this. Some contract work. Gaps." He paused. "We have a different file." The documentation station hummed. Down the hallway, a cart rattled past. "I'm not here to make trouble," he said. "I'm here because Sergeant Pruitt told the surgical team while they were prepping him that he wanted me to make sure the major was taken care of." He let that sit for a second. His words. Claire looked at the card on the desk. "You don't have to call it," he said, "but I'd recommend not letting what happened tonight go undocumented from our side. What your supervisor said to you after. We have the room mic'd. Standard protocol for federally monitored operations." He stood. "It's a clean recording." He left. She didn't pick up the card. She looked at it for a while, then went back to charting. At 5:15 a.m., Kyle Reeves came to find her. She heard him coming. His footsteps had a particular rhythm, slightly faster than comfortable. The stride of someone who'd rehearsed what they were going to say and was moving before the rehearsal ran out. He stopped at the edge of the documentation station and put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. "The thing in there," he started. "I don't need anything from you," she said. "I wasn't going to—" He stopped. "I just wanted to say that I was wrong about the BP differential. You were right, and I was wrong." He said it like it cost him something, because it did. He wasn't built for this sentence. "I've been right most of the time, and I don't always check myself when I'm not." She looked at him. His face was doing something uncomfortable and human that she hadn't seen it do before. "Okay," she said. He waited, like he'd expected more. She went back to the chart. He left. She thought about what he'd said. She thought about the fact that he'd said it at all, which was harder than most people understood. Not the words themselves, but the act of crossing the space required to deliver them. She didn't forgive the months of condescension in one 5-sentence apology at 5 in the morning, but she filed it differently than she'd been filing him before. People were not a fixed thing. She'd seen enough of them in enough conditions to know that. The morning shift started filtering in at 6. Normal, noisy. The incoming nurses with their coffee cups and their update seeking, and the particular chaos of handoff, which Claire had always thought was the most dangerous part of any hospital day. The information gap between the people leaving and the people arriving, the things that got missed in transition. She gave her handoff to the oncoming nurse with the thorough, specific quality she always brought to it. Every patient, every detail, every flag. It took longer than the usual handoff. The oncoming nurse, a woman named Paula, who'd worked the day shift for 9 years and had approximately 0 patients for ceremony, listened with the efficient attention of someone who knew the value of what she was being told. "Room 3's potassium was rechecked at 420, Claire said. "It's trending up, but she's anxious. She responds well if you explain what you're seeing." Paula made the note. "You look terrible. I've been on since yesterday afternoon." "Margaret know you're still here?" "Margaret knows everything that happens in this building," Claire said. "Whether she acts on it is a different question." Paula gave her a look. Not quite sympathetic, not quite knowing, somewhere in the middle, and moved off to start her rounds. Claire sat down in the break room and drank the rest of a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and stared at the table. She was tired in the specific bone-level way that came from a long shift, compounded by adrenaline, compounded by the emotional work of suppressing everything she'd felt in the trauma room. Her left arm ached where the old scar tissue ran. It always did when the weather changed or when she'd been tense for a long time. She thought about Dale Pruitt. She thought about what it meant that he'd set her rank in that room, in front of those people. She'd had a plan. It was a quiet plan, the kind that didn't require announcing. Come in, do the work, don't draw attention, don't become an issue. She had reasons for the plan that she'd spent 2 years not examining too carefully, because examining them required visiting things she'd put down deliberately, and she wasn't sure she was ready to pick them back up. But Dale Pruitt had set her rank in a room full of federal agents, and one of those agents had a recording, and she'd performed a battlefield trauma procedure in an American civilian ER in front of a federal detail. And the plan, the quiet, careful, invisible plan, had a significant structural problem now. She picked up Harwick's card off the table. She didn't remember picking it up. She turned it over. Standard federal contact card. Name, a number, a small agency identifier in the corner that she recognized. She put it in her scrub pocket and went to get her bag. So, Margaret Holt was waiting for her at the exit. Not the main exit, the staff exit, the one through the east corridor that led to the parking structure. Margaret was standing beside the door with her tablet under her arm and her coat already on, which meant she'd been waiting long enough to get cold. And the expression on her face was the one she wore when she'd made a decision she'd already built a justification for. "We need to talk," Margaret said. "My shift ended 20 minutes ago." "This won't take long." Claire stopped walking but didn't close the remaining distance. She stood where she was, bag over her shoulder, in the particular fluorescent purgatory of a hospital exit corridor at 6:30 in the morning, and waited. "I've been in contact with Dr. Harmon," Margaret said. That was the chief medical officer. "Given what happened tonight, the unauthorized procedure, the violation of chain of command protocols, the conduct in a federally monitored environment, there's going to be a formal review. That process will begin today." She paused. Given the severity of the situation, we're recommending that you be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. You're suspending me. We're placing you on leave, while you conduct a review that you're already describing as a disciplinary process. Claire looked at her. You're suspending me because I saved a patient. I'm placing you on leave because you violated, because I saw a tension pneumothorax that was going to kill someone in 90 seconds, and I addressed it, and the patient is alive, and now you're building a case to fire me for it. Her voice stayed level. The anger was there. It had been there all night, but she had learned, over years and conditions that had nothing to do with this hospital, how to keep her voice level when she needed to. That's what's happening. Margaret's expression didn't change. Turn in your badge before you leave the building. I'm not turning in my badge, Claire said. I'm going home. When I receive formal documentation of a leave action, I'll respond through the appropriate channels. She walked through the exit. Behind her, she heard Margaret say something. It didn't resolve into words, just tone. But she didn't stop. The parking structure was cold and mostly empty in the early morning, the concrete still holding the chill of the night. Claire walked to her car, a 9-year-old Subaru with a cracked passenger side mirror, and put her bag in the back and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her phone had 7 missed calls. 3 were from a number she didn't recognize. 2 were from her union rep, which meant Margaret had already called the union, which meant the documentation process had started before Margaret had even spoken to her at the exit. 1 was from a Colorado Springs area code she'd been careful not to call for 2 years. The last was from a number with a DC prefix she didn't recognize. She sat with the phone in her hands. The DC number had left a voicemail. She listened to it with her eyes on the concrete wall of the parking structure, the engine not running, the morning coming gray through the structure's gaps. The voice on the voicemail was measured and precise and identified itself by name and rank. A rank that was high enough that Claire sat up straighter instinctively. The reflex of 2 decades lived in structures where rank meant something specific. The message was short. It said that there were people who were aware of what had happened at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center in the early hours of the morning. It said that certain records had been accessed and that certain conversations had been had. It said that if she was willing to speak, someone would make themselves available at whatever time was convenient for her. It said, "We're aware that you've been trying to step back from this world, Major, but it appears the world has found you regardless." Claire lowered the phone. Outside, the morning traffic on the street beyond the parking structure was starting to build. The ordinary world moving at its ordinary pace, 8-lane highway noise, and the distant complaint of a garbage truck. The Delafield morning assembling itself the way it did every day. She thought about Dale Pruitt, who had found her face in a room full of people. She thought about 22 months of inventory counts and documentation duty and nobody knowing what she was. She thought about the recording Harwick had mentioned, the clean audio of Margaret telling her to step away from a patient who was about to die, and what it meant that that recording existed, and what it meant that Harwick had told her it existed. She started the car. She sat for another moment, engine running, hands on the wheel. Then she picked up her phone and called the DC number back. It rang once. "Major Donovan," the voice said. "Not a question." "I'm listening," she said, and in the office at the end of the East Corridor, Margaret Holt was already on the phone with the hospital's legal team, reading aloud from a disciplinary memo she'd drafted before Claire's shift had even ended, before the patient had arrived, before the trauma room, before any of it. A memo with a date that didn't match when she claimed to have written it. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Brigadier General Susan Trace, and she did not waste time on preamble. "We've been monitoring the situation at Hargrove since 0200, she said. "When Sergeant Pruitt's extraction team flagged your name in the personnel roster, it triggered a review. What happened in that trauma room has been documented from our side." "How much do you know?" Claire asked. "Enough." A pause. Not hesitation, just the measured beat of someone choosing the order of information. The suspension action your supervisor is filing is going to run into some complications. I want you to understand that before you decide how to proceed. Claire looked at the parking structure wall. What kind of complications? The kind that come with a federal record of a head nurse instructing medical personnel to stand down during an active trauma resuscitation of a military operator, while that operator was dying. Another pause. We have audio. We have the room footage from our own equipment. Our teams record all federally monitored operations as standard protocol. What we have is not ambiguous. Outside the car, a maintenance worker was moving through the structure pushing a cart, wheels echoing on concrete. The ordinary world. "I'm not looking for a fight," Claire said. "I know you're not. That's not what this is." Trace's voice shifted slightly. Not softer, but different. Direct in a different direction. "You left for reasons that were yours to have. Nobody is calling that into question. But what happened tonight is a matter of federal record now. And the woman who is currently on the phone with a hospital attorney building a case to terminate your employment needs to understand the environment she's operating in before she files anything. And if I don't want it handled that way, then tell me that and I'll respect it. But I'd ask you to think about the next nurse in that ER, the next patient who codes while Reeves freezes and Holt decides who gets to be in the room." Claire said nothing. "You don't have to come back to anything you left behind," Trace said. "This isn't a recruitment call. This is someone telling you that you are not alone in a parking structure at 6:30 in the morning with a suspension memo being typed 50 yards away from where you're sitting." The maintenance worker had disappeared around the corner. The structure was quiet again. "What do you need from me?" Claire asked. "A conversation, in person, today if possible." A pause. "And in the meantime, don't turn in your badge." Guas. She drove home on autopilot, the way she did after long shifts, muscle memory navigating the turns while her actual mind was somewhere else. Her apartment was 12 minutes from the hospital. A deliberate choice, one of several deliberate choices she'd made when she took the position at Hargrove, a series of calibrations designed to produce a life that was manageable, contained, not demanding too much of her in any particular direction. The apartment was clean and quiet and had almost no personal items visible from the door. A couch, a bookshelf with paperbacks arranged by size, a kitchen that functioned and a bedroom that served its purpose. She'd been in it 2 years and it still looked like a place someone had recently moved into or was about to move out of. She showered and changed and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and her phone face up in front of her. The union rep had left a second message while she was driving. His name was Gordon Sievers, and he was a practical man who had spent 12 years representing hospital staff in disciplinary proceedings and had heard most of the things that could happen in a healthcare institution and had stopped being surprised by them. His message said that he'd received Margaret's preliminary filing, that it was aggressive but not unprecedented, and that he needed to talk to Claire before 10 a.m. because the hospital's legal team had requested an emergency board session for that afternoon. An emergency board session. Margaret had moved fast. Claire gave her credit for that, in the cold way she gave credit to opponents who operated efficiently. She called Gordon back. He picked up in 2 rings. "Tell me what happened," she told him. Not the parts with Harwick and the recording, not yet, just the clinical sequence. The patient, the pneumothorax, the intervention, the post-resuscitation conversation in Margaret's office. Gordon listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, because interrupting was a way of inserting your framework over someone else's facts, and she needed him to have her facts first. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Reeves is going to be a problem," he said, "if he supports Margaret's account. He may not." "What makes you say that?" "He came to find me at 5 a.m. and told me I was right about the pressure differential." She paused. "He's not going to publicly contradict Margaret in a board proceeding, but he might not support her the way she expects him to, either." Gordon made a sound that wasn't quite agreement. "The charge is unauthorized procedure plus insubordination. They're going to frame it as a patient safety issue, which is the framing that's hardest to fight because it puts you in the position of arguing that what you did was safe, which sounds like you're defending the risk rather than, "I'm going to have some federal documentation of what happened in that room," Claire said. "Recording and video. I don't have it yet, but I've been told it exists and that it will support my account." The silence on the other end had a different quality than the previous silence. "Federal documentation," Gordon said slowly. The patient was a military operator transported under federal escort. Standard protocol. They record all personnel interactions in federally monitored environments. Another pause. Claire, how do you know their protocol? She didn't answer that directly. Can you delay the board session? I need until tomorrow morning. I can try to push for 48 hours on procedural grounds. They're required to give you notice. How fast can you get this documentation? I have a call this afternoon. Okay. She could hear him recalibrating on the other end, adjusting the architecture of his approach to accommodate this new variable. In the meantime, do not go to the hospital. Do not respond to any communication from Margaret or from HR without me. And if anyone from administration calls you directly, I'll forward it to you. Good. He paused. For what it's worth, what you described doing in that room. That's not unauthorized practice. That's emergency intervention under a duty of care standard. Any reasonable medical ethics board would recognize the distinction. Margaret's not filing with a medical ethics board. She's filing with the hospital. Yeah, he said. She is. The meeting with Trace happened at 2 in the afternoon in a federal building in downtown Delfield that Claire hadn't known existed. A nondescript office suite on the 4th floor of a building that appeared from the outside to house an insurance company. Harwick met her at the entrance and walked her up without speaking, which she appreciated. Trace was not what Claire had expected from a phone voice, and then immediately was exactly what she should have expected. A woman in her mid-50s with short gray hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where posture carried information. She was in civilian clothes, which was a choice that meant something. She stood when Claire came in and extended her hand and shook it once, firmly, and did not smile in the performative way of someone managing a delicate situation. Sit down, she said. You look like you haven't slept. I haven't. Then I'll be efficient. She sat. Here's where we are. The hospital's legal team filed a preliminary disciplinary action this morning at 7:42. The grounds are unauthorized clinical procedure, insubordination, and, this is the one that concerns me, what they're calling misrepresentation of credentials, which appears to be a reference to the fact that your employment file does not reflect your full clinical background. Claire looked at her. You listed your nursing licensure, your civilian certifications, your Montana contract work, Trace said. You did not list your military service or your clinical designations from that service. The hospital is arguing this constitutes credential fraud. I wasn't required to list it. My nursing license is current and legitimate. The additional qualifications from military service aren't part of the civilian credentialing system. You and I know that. Their attorney is going to argue that by omitting a background that includes advanced trauma training at a level that exceeds your listed credentials, you created a misleading professional profile. She folded her hands on the desk. It's not a strong argument, but it's an argument, and it's designed to make the board proceeding complicated enough that a settlement becomes attractive. A settlement where I resign quietly. Yes. The room was neutral, bureaucratic, the kind of space designed to contain things without marking them. Claire looked at the surface of the desk and thought about 22 months of inventory counts. What do you have? She asked. Trace opened a folder, not a digital file, paper, which was a statement about how this meeting was going to be documented. She turned it so Claire could read it. The first page was a transcript, audio, time-stamped, with speakers labeled by position, head nurse, physician, Federal Agent 1, patient, nurse. The patient's lines were almost nothing, fragmented, barely readable, but the head nurse's lines were complete and clear. Stay out of the way, just hand us supplies. Security? Get security in here. The nurse's lines, peak, Claire's lines, but were also complete. He's got a tension pneumo, left side. You need to decompress now. His trachea is deviating. You can see it. If you wait for imaging, he's going to arrest. And below that, time-stamped 11 seconds later, pulse ox, 74%. And below that, 4 minutes and 32 seconds later, pulse ox, 91%. The numbers told the story more cleanly than any testimony. The video matches the transcript, Trace said. You can see the physician's position, the patient's condition indicators on the monitor behind the gurney, and the timeline of intervention versus stabilization. She paused. You can also see very clearly the head nurse moving toward the patient to physically remove you from the bedside at the moment of decompression. Claire looked at the paper without touching it. We're prepared to submit this as a federal record in any proceeding the hospital initiates, Trace said, not to punish anyone, to make sure the factual record is accurate. And in exchange? There's no exchange. Trace looked at her steadily. You saved one of ours. We don't trade favors on that. She paused, and for the first time, something in her expression moved slightly off the professional baseline. We look after our people, even the ones who've decided they're not our people anymore. Claire looked at her hands on the table. The left one, if you looked at the right angle in the right light, showed the edge of the scar tissue above the wrist. She'd kept her sleeves down for 2 years. I need something else, Claire said. Trace waited. Margaret's disciplinary memo, the one she filed this morning. Claire looked up. What time did you say she filed it? 7:42. My shift ended at 6:30. The incident in the trauma room happened at approximately 2:15 a.m. She paused. Margaret came to the staff exit before I left and told me a review was going to begin. She said she'd been in contact with the CMO. She said the memo would be filed. Trace was listening with her full attention now. She also said she'd drafted the memo herself before I left the building. Claire kept her voice even. A disciplinary memo for an incident that was still active when she told me she'd already written it, which means she may have drafted it before the incident concluded, possibly before she knew what the outcome was going to be. The room went quiet. Harwick, who was standing near the door, moved his weight slightly from one foot to the other. If the memo was drafted before the patient stabilized, Trace said slowly, that's not a disciplinary action in response to an incident. That's a predetermined termination document that was filled in after the fact. I'd like to know what time it was created, Claire said. The file metadata. Trace looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to classify. Not quite respect, not quite surprise, something in between that was more specific than either. She made a note. I'll have someone look at that, she said. The board session was pushed to the following morning. Gordon got his 48 hours on procedural grounds. The hospital's attorney objected but couldn't overcome the notice requirement, and the delay was enough to allow 3 things to happen that Margaret Holt had not planned for. The first was that Kyle Reeves, sometime in the early afternoon of that day, requested a meeting with the CMO that did not include Margaret. What happened in that meeting was not immediately known, but the CMO's assistant, a woman named June, who had worked for him for 11 years, and was therefore invisible to everyone in the hospital in the specific way that long-tenure administrative staff became invisible, told Tomas, who told Sarah Yamaoka, who told Gordon Seaver's paralegal that the meeting had lasted 40 minutes and that Dr. Harmon had come out of it looking like he had a headache developing behind his left eye. The second thing was that Harwick filed the federal record, transcript, video, pulse ox timeline with the Colorado Department of Health, which had jurisdiction over nursing disciplinary proceedings and was, as a matter of regulatory structure, upstream of Hargrove Memorial's internal board. The third thing was that the file metadata on Margaret's disciplinary memo showed a creation timestamp of 1:58 a.m., 17 minutes before the federally monitored patient had arrived at the hospital. Claire was sitting in Gordon's office when he got the metadata report. He read it twice, which was one more time than he usually needed to read anything. Then he set it down on the desk and looked at her with the expression of a man reassembling his understanding of a situation. She wrote it before he came in, he said. She wrote it before she knew what she was writing about, Claire said. She just filled in the incident afterward. That's not a disciplinary action. That's a termination she was building, regardless of what happened that night. He sat back. Were you in her way on something? Is there something I don't know about? Budget, staffing, something she was trying to accomplish that required you not to be there? Claire thought about 22 months. The inventory counts, the documentation duty, the back-to-back overnights and the worst assignments and the small, systematic diminishments that were never individually significant enough to file a grievance over but accumulated into something structural. I asked questions, she said, when the staffing was unsafe, when the assignments put patients at risk. I didn't push hard. I mostly just did what needed doing, but I asked questions. And she didn't like that. People like Margaret don't dislike the questions, Claire said. They dislike that the questions imply there's something worth questioning. Gordon looked at the metadata report again. The board session tomorrow, he said. They're walking in expecting to review a disciplinary action, and they're going to get something considerably more complicated. He paused. How do you want to handle the military record question? The credential misrepresentation charge? Honestly, she said, all of it. He looked at her. I've been careful about what I shared because I was trying to be private, not because I was hiding anything that affected patient safety, she said. I think that distinction is going to be clear when the board sees what the record actually contains. You're going to have to explain what it contains. I know. He nodded slowly. Get some sleep and eat something. You look like you've been running on adrenaline since yesterday. She had been. She knew it. The crash was coming. It always did, after the kind of night she'd had. But she needed it to wait one more day. She drove back to the apartment and made something to eat that she didn't taste and sat on the couch and thought about the board session and what she was going to say and what it was going to cost to say it after 2 years of deliberate silence. Her phone buzzed at 8:47 p.m. A text from a number she didn't have saved, but she recognized the format. Pruitt is out of surgery, stable. He's been asking about you. She looked at the message for a while. Then she typed back, Tell him I said good. She put the phone down and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the things she'd left behind and whether leaving them had served the purpose she'd intended. She didn't have a clean answer. She fell asleep on the couch with the lamp still on. The board session was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the hospital's administrative conference room on the 3rd floor, a room she'd never been in, that she'd only known existed from the layout diagram posted in the nursing orientation binder that nobody read past page 4. She arrived with Gordon at 8:52, which was deliberate. Not early enough to seem anxious, not late enough to lose control of the entrance. The conference room had a long table with 7 chairs on each side. The board members were already seated, 5 of them, including the CMO, Dr. Harmon, who looked like the headache from yesterday had not resolved. Margaret was on the left side of the table with the hospital's legal counsel, a man named Forsyth, who had the carefully neutral expression of someone paid to maintain it. There was an empty seat beside Margaret that had a folder in front of it. Kyle Reeves's folder. His empty chair. Margaret noticed Claire notice it. Something moved across her face. Not panic, but an adjustment. A recalibration she was trying to execute smoothly and not quite managing. Claire sat down. Gordon set his briefcase on the table and opened it in the deliberate way of someone who had everything he needed and knew exactly where it was. Dr. Harmon cleared his throat. We'll wait another few minutes for... The door opened. But it wasn't Kyle Reeves. It was a man in dress uniform who Claire recognized and Gordon did not, and none of the board members did, except that they all understood within approximately 2 seconds that his rank insignia meant that whatever meeting they thought they were having was about to become a different meeting entirely. Behind him came Harwick, and behind Harwick came a woman from the Colorado Department of Health that Forsyth, the hospital's attorney, apparently knew by name, because the color left his face in the specific way of a man who has just understood that the room he is in is not the room he prepared for. Margaret looked at Claire. Claire looked back at her. And then the door opened a 3rd time, and Kyle Reeves walked in, and he was not carrying Margaret's folder. He was carrying his own. He set the folder down at the far end of the table, away from Margaret's side, and took the seat next to it without looking at her. That was the tell. Not the folder, not the uniform at the door, not Forsyth's color draining out. It was the simple fact that Kyle Reeves sat down on the wrong side of the room and didn't look at the woman who had spent 2 years running interference for his career. And in that single physical choice, he communicated everything about what his folder contained before anyone had opened it. Margaret understood it. Claire could see her understand it. The small adjustment in her posture, a tightening across the shoulders that she managed to keep off her face, but couldn't quite keep out of her body. 15 years of institutional authority, and she was sitting in a room that had just rearranged itself around her without asking permission. The man in dress uniform introduced himself as Colonel Warren Adst, and he did it briefly, the way people with significant rank introduced themselves in rooms where the rank was already doing most of the communicating. He identified his office and his relationship to the federal operation that had brought Sergeant Dale Pruitt to Hargrove Memorial at 2:14 a.m. 2 days prior. He then indicated Harwick, who nodded once, and the woman from the Colorado Department of Health, whose name was Dr. Pamela Rourke, and who had the specific bearing of a regulator who had been doing this long enough to find very little of it surprising. Dr. Harmon said, carefully, "We appreciate We weren't expecting—" "I know you weren't," Colonel Odds said. "We'll try to be efficient." Forsyth, the hospital's attorney, had recovered some of his composure, which Claire noted. He was good at his job. "The hospital welcomes any relevant federal input," he said, with the smooth professional neutrality of someone buying time to think. "However, this proceeding is an internal personnel matter, and the board will want to—" The proceeding became a federal matter when the hospital initiated disciplinary action against personnel for clinical decisions made during a federally monitored operation, Odset said. "Not aggressive, just factual, in the way that facts became aggressive when they were precise enough. We have a legitimate interest in the record." Forsyth looked at his own folder, then at Harmon. Then he made the small movement of a man deciding to stop swimming against the current, for now. Dr. Rourke opened her bag and set 2 documents on the table, one in front of Harmon, one slid to Forsyth. "The department received a formal submission from the federal operational team yesterday afternoon," she said. "Audio transcript, video record, and physiological data from the monitored environment. We've reviewed it. I'm here as an observer to ensure any findings from this proceeding are consistent with our own regulatory review, which we've opened concurrently." Margaret said, in a voice that had almost none of the authority it usually carried, "A regulatory review. Standard protocol when a disciplinary action against a licensed nurse involves clinical decisions made under emergency conditions," Rourke said. She looked at Margaret with the dispassionate attention of someone taking inventory. "The department reviews the underlying facts independently. We don't defer to hospital findings." The room settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of things being decided, but the quiet of things already decided waiting to be announced. Gordon Sievers opened his briefcase, removed his own set of documents, and distributed them down the board members' side of the table with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had been in rooms like this before and knew that the first person who seemed rushed lost something. He remained standing as he did it, which kept him in front of the room a moment longer. "Before the board reviews the hospital's disciplinary filing," he said, "I'd like to draw attention to an item in the documentation packet on page 3, the file metadata for the disciplinary memo." He sat down. The board members turned to page 3. Harmon got there first, read the timestamp, and put the page down with the deliberate flatness of a man trying not to show what he was feeling. Forsyth had gone to page 3 as well. He was still looking at it. "The memo was created at 1:58 a.m., Gordon said. "The patient arrived at the hospital at 2:14 a.m. The clinical incident that the memo purports to document occurred between approximately 2:16 and 2:43 a.m. He paused. "The document that your legal team filed as a disciplinary action in response to specific nursing conduct was written before that conduct occurred." Margaret said, "That timestamp is a system error. The hospital's documentation software has a known—" "I'd like to see that in writing," Gordon said. "From IT, dated prior to today." Margaret looked at Forsyth. Forsyth was still looking at page 3. "Ms. Holt." Dr. Harmon's voice had gone to a register Claire hadn't heard from him before. Flat and careful, the voice of a man managing something he didn't know the full shape of yet. "Is there an explanation for this timestamp that we should hear?" Margaret straightened in her chair. "The memo documents a pattern of conduct that predates Tuesday night. I had been building documentation on Ms. Donovan's performance issues for—" "The memo doesn't reference a pattern," Gordon said. "It references a specific incident. It names the incident as the grounds for the action. It describes events that hadn't happened when the document was created. You anticipated a specific patient arriving, a specific clinical event occurring, and a specific nurse's response to that event, before any of those things happened." Gordon's voice was exactly as calm as it had been since he walked in. "That's not performance documentation. That's predetermined termination. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it. She was doing the rapid internal arithmetic of someone whose position had just shifted under them and was trying to find stable ground, and Claire could see from the slight wrongness of her expression that she wasn't finding it. Harmon looked at the other board members. A retired physician named Calloway, who'd been on the Hargrove board for a decade. A finance director named Bright, who handled capital accounts and rarely spoke in personnel matters. A community representative named Walsh, who was, at this moment, reading page 3, with the slow, careful attention of someone making sure they understood it correctly before they said anything. Walsh set the page down. Dr. Harmon, how long has Ms. Holt been head of nursing? 15 years. Walsh nodded, said nothing else. But the question had done its work. Colonel Odst spoke for 11 minutes. He didn't editorialize. He moved through the federal record in the order it had happened. The patient's arrival, the clinical status on entry, the intervention timeline, the physiological data before and after decompression. He quoted the pulse ox numbers, 74 on arrival, 91 4 minutes and 32 seconds post-intervention. He noted the timestamp of the head nurse's instruction to remove the intervening nurse from the patient's bedside. He noted that this instruction occurred at a moment when the patient's saturation was 74 and dropping. He did not say she was going to let him die rather than let this nurse save him. He didn't need to. The numbers said it. When he finished, he placed the federal submission in the center of the table and folded his hands. Forsyth said carefully, "The hospital's position is that protocol exists for a reason, and that the deviation from protocol, however well-intentioned..." With respect, Odsit said, the protocol question is downstream of the patient outcome question, and the patient outcome question has been answered by the data. Any protocol argument your client makes will be weighed against a documented pulse ox of 74 and a documented instruction to remove the person who addressed it. He looked at Forsyth with the patience of a man who had made his point and was simply waiting for the other side to accept that it had been made. "I think carefully about which hill this becomes." Forsyth looked at Margaret again. This time she didn't look back. Kyle Reeves's folder had been sitting in front of him untouched. He put his hand on it. Every person in the room tracked the movement. "I've prepared a statement," he said. His voice was different from the voice he used in the ER. Less curated, less performing its own confidence. He sounded younger, which was not a bad thing. "I want it on record before the board makes any findings." Harmon said, "Go ahead." Reeves opened the folder and looked at the first page. Claire could see from across the table that there were handwritten notes in the margin, the kind people made when they drafted something, walked away from it, come back and changed their mind about parts of it. The edits were visible. He hadn't rewritten a clean copy, which meant either he hadn't had time or he'd decided the edits were part of what he was presenting. She thought it was the latter. "On the night in question," he said, "I was the attending physician managing the incoming patient. I want to be clear that my initial differential included tension pneumothorax." He paused. "I also want to be clear that I had not acted on that differential at the point when Nurse Donovan intervened. She acted faster and more decisively than I did, and the patient's outcome reflects that." Another pause. "She did not contradict my judgment. I had not expressed my judgment. She filled a gap that I had not filled." The room was very quiet. "I've been at Hargrove for 2 years," he said. He stopped, looked at the handwritten margin note for a second, seemed to decide something. "I've treated Nurse Donovan as less than she is, professionally. I was wrong about her clinical capabilities. I was wrong about her." He closed the folder. "That's what I have." He did not look at Margaret when he finished. He looked at the center of the table. Claire looked at him. She thought about the night he'd corrected her in front of patients, the air announcement voice, the careful condescension. She thought about 5 in the morning in the documentation station and what it cost a person of his particular construction to say the things he'd just said in a formal proceeding. She would not call it redemption. That was a word for stories that wrapped too clean, but it was something real, and she filed it where real things went. The board recessed at 10:47 a.m. The recesses in these proceedings were not about deliberation, not primarily. They were about the conversations that happened in the hallways and the side rooms, the ones where people figured out what was true before they went back in and made it official. Claire knew this. Gordon knew this. They sat in the waiting area outside the conference room with bad coffee and said almost nothing to each other because they'd said what needed saying and now it was out of their hands. At 11:20, Forsyth emerged from the conference room and asked to speak with Gordon privately. Gordon looked at Claire. She nodded. They were gone 12 minutes. When Gordon came back, he sat down and drank the rest of his coffee, which had to be cold by then, and set the cup down. "They're dropping the disciplinary action," he said. She exhaled slowly through her nose. "There's more," he said. "Harmon wants to meet with you this afternoon. Not a formal proceeding, a direct conversation. He's asking if you're willing." "About what?" He didn't say, but Forsyth's posture when he asked, Gordon turned the empty cup in his hands. "I've seen that posture before. It usually means the institution has figured out that the problem isn't the person they were trying to fire. It's someone else." Claire looked at the door of the conference room. "Also," Gordon said, "Rourke from the Department of Health asked me to let you know that their regulatory review of Ms. Holt's conduct will proceed independently of the hospital's internal findings. That review includes the predetermined documentation and the recorded instruction during the monitored resuscitation." "What does that mean for Margaret?" "At minimum, a formal investigation into her fitness to hold a supervisory nursing license. The recorded instruction is, it's bad, Claire. Telling staff to stand down during an active resuscitation. The department takes that seriously. She's been running that floor for 15 years. I know. How many times do you think this happened before there was a federal camera in the room?" Gordon didn't answer because there wasn't an answer. There was only the fact of the question. Dr. Harmon's office was on the 3rd floor, adjacent to the conference room, and it looked like the office of a man who had been in the same position long enough for the space to accumulate the particular clutter of deferred decisions. Stacked reports, a whiteboard with items that hadn't been erased in what looked like months, a window that overlooked the hospital's east parking lot and had a half-dead plant on the sill that nobody had watered recently enough. He was 61 and had the look of a man who'd been a competent physician and had spent the last decade finding out that running a hospital required a completely different set of skills that he'd been acquiring imperfectly on the job. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and waited until Claire and Gordon were both seated before he spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said. Claire said nothing. "I've been made aware, this morning, in a way I should have been made aware much earlier, of the pattern of assignment practices on the overnight ER nursing floor." He had a folder open in front of him, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at her, which she noted. Documentation of staffing irregularities, assignment overloads concentrated on specific personnel, and management practices that I should have reviewed and didn't. He paused. "I didn't know because I wasn't looking. That's not an excuse." "It's accurate, though," Claire said. He absorbed that. "Yes, it is. What specifically are you looking at?" "Payroll records going back to your hire date show that you've been assigned overtime shifts at a rate approximately 3 times higher than any other nurse on the floor. Your patient assignment totals on single shifts exceeded floor protocol on 27 documented occasions. You were assigned documentation duties, desk-only work, on 11 nights following shifts when you'd raise staffing concerns with your supervisor." He closed the folder. "It's a pattern that's hard to explain as anything other than deliberate." Gordon leaned forward slightly. "The union will be filing a formal grievance on the assignment irregularities." "That's appropriate," Harmon said, "and we won't contest it." He looked at Claire again. "The board has voted to fully reinstate you, effective immediately, with back pay for any shifts lost due to the administrative action and a formal letter of record clearing the disciplinary filing." Claire said, "And Margaret?" Harmon's hands moved on the desk. Not fidgeting, just shifting, the hands of a man carrying weight. "Ms. Holt has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending the Department of Health review. She will not be returning to a supervisory role at this hospital." He paused. "That's a decision the board made this morning before the session ended." The plant on the windowsill was dropping a leaf. It fell in Claire's peripheral vision and landed on the sill without sound. "There's something else," Harmon said. Gordon looked up. The board has been discussing the nursing director position for the ER for approximately 8 months. We've had difficulty identifying a candidate. Harmon's voice had shifted. Still formal, but with a different quality under it. The quality of someone making a case rather than delivering a ruling. Given what the federal record shows about your clinical background, and given what I've observed this morning about how you operate, what you were doing on that floor for 22 months, not just Tuesday night, but the staffing coverage, the patient handoffs, the work you were doing that was nowhere in your job description. I was doing my job, Claire said. You were doing someone else's job too, he said. Several people's jobs. He paused. I'd like to talk about what it would look like for you to do it officially. The room was quiet for a moment. I'm not making a formal offer in this meeting, he said, that would go through proper channels with appropriate notice and process. I'm asking if you'd be willing to have a conversation. Claire looked at him. She thought about what Trace had said on the phone at 6:30 in the morning. Think about the next nurse in that ER. She thought about Sarah Yamaoka with her hands flat on the break room table and Tomas taking half a step forward because nobody had told him where to be. She thought about 27 shifts with patient assignments above protocol and the invisible arithmetic she'd been running for 2 years just to keep the floor from hurting someone. I'll have the conversation, she said. Bad. She left the hospital at 1 in the afternoon and drove without a destination for 20 minutes, which was something she did when she needed to move without having to arrive anywhere. The city moved past the windows, Dellfield in October, the mountains visible from every east-facing street, a blue that had no equivalent she'd found anywhere else. Her phone rang at 1:40, a hospital number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. This is Claire Donovan. Major Donovan? A voice she knew, one of Pruitt's team, she thought, from the extraction. She'd heard it in the trauma room in the dark hours, one of the agents calling the timeline. Sergeant Pruitt is asking if you'll come up. He's been cleared for visitors. She thought about the parking structure and the decision she'd made to call back and how every subsequent thing had followed from that decision. She thought about the plan she'd built, quiet, invisible, contained, and how completely it had failed to account for the world's indifference to her plans. Tell him I'm on my way, she said. The surgical floor was different from the ER, a different temperature, a different rhythm, the particular stillness of people recovering rather than arriving. She signed in at the desk and followed the room numbers down a corridor where the afternoon light came through at a low angle and made squares on the linoleum. Pruitt's room had an agent outside the door. He recognized her and moved aside without being asked. The room was standard issue, bed, monitors, the usual equipment. Pruitt was propped at 30 degrees, IV in his left arm, the left side of his chest wrapped under the hospital gown. His color was better than it had been 2 nights ago, which was a low bar, but the improvement was real. He looked like a man who had been seriously hurt and had not yet fully processed that he was going to be okay. He looked at her when she came in, and something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, something older and more complicated than relief. You look terrible, he said. You nearly died 2 days ago, she said. You don't get to comment on appearances. He made a sound that was almost a laugh and then stopped because it hurt. Sit down. I've been awake since 5 and I've had about 60 hours of things to think about. She pulled the chair from beside the window and sat. They told me what happened, he said. After. The board thing. The suspension. It's been handled. I know it has. Harwick keeps me updated. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. I'm sorry. He stopped, looked for the right word. For blowing your cover. It was the morphine and the fact that I was reasonably convinced I was dying, but I know that's not Dale. She said his name the way she had in the storage shed, a long time ago, in the specific tone that meant stop. You didn't blow anything. I was already... She paused. It was already complicated. You were trying to be invisible. I was trying to rest, she said. And that was the truest version of it she'd found. Not hiding, not running, just trying to find a version of her life that didn't cost so much every day. I don't think that's available to me anymore. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you going back?" he asked. "To the army?" "No." She said it without hesitation, and it was still true. "But I'm not going back to Invisible either." He nodded, seemed to accept that. "She offered you the director position, didn't she?" he said. Not a question. Harmon opened the conversation. And I haven't decided anything." She looked at him. "How did you know I was at Hargrove?" The question had been in the back of her mind since 2 a.m. 2 days ago. She'd assumed the operational deployment had been coincidence, the nearest Level 2 trauma center, the fastest transport, the standard calculus of emergency medicine logistics. But she'd been thinking about it, and the math didn't entirely work. There were other options. Not closer, but not significantly farther. Pruitt's expression changed in a way that was hard to read. "Dale, it wasn't intentional," he said. "It wasn't like I knew. But Ashford was on the list as a possible transport, and someone on the coordination team ran personnel, and your name came up as a flag, as someone with a clinical history that matched the injury type." He paused. "The transport decision went to the team leader, not to me. I didn't know until we were already in the vehicle." She absorbed this. "The team leader knew I was there," she said. "He knew there was a nurse at Hargrove with a trauma background that matched the need. He didn't know—" Pruitt stopped. "I don't know exactly what he knew. I'm telling you what I was told." Claire sat with this for a moment. The shape of it was uncomfortable. Not sinister, but not clean. Somewhere in the operational chain, a decision had been made that had found her, and she wasn't sure yet whether to be angry about it or simply to accept it as a fact of the world she'd tried to leave and hadn't entirely managed to. "I'll need to talk to Harwick," she said. "He's expecting you to." She stood up. "Get some sleep. You're still post-surgical, and you look like you've been awake since 5 trying to manage things that don't need managing." "You sound like a nurse." "I am a nurse," she said. He looked at her with something that was not quite amusement and not quite grief. "Yeah," he said. "You are." She was halfway to the door when he said her name, her rank again, the old reflex, and she stopped. "Whatever you decide," he said. "About the job. About any of it." He paused. "You were the best trauma specialist I ever worked with, and that was in conditions that made Tuesday night look like a practice drill." She didn't respond to that. She put her hand on the door. "The team leader who made the call," she said, without turning around. "Who was he reporting to?" A pause. "Trace," Pruitt said. Claire's hand stayed on the door. The corridor beyond was quiet, the afternoon light going long and flat across the linoleum. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The plant in Harmon's office was still dying, and somewhere in the hospital, Margaret Holt was cleaning out her desk or had already cleaned it out. And Kyle Reeves was in a trauma bay learning in real time what it meant to be the most knowledgeable person in the room who was still not enough. And Susan Trace had known she was at Hargrove before the call at 6:30 in the morning. Had positioned an asset, Pruitt's transport, the operational need, in a way that found her at the exact moment her quiet, invisible life became untenable. It hadn't been coincidence, and it hadn't been Pruitt's morphine. She stood at the door and considered this and felt something she recognized from a very long time ago, the particular sensation of understanding that you are already inside a situation that someone else designed, and that your choices from here are not about whether to be in it, but about what you do now that you are. She pushed through the door and walked down the corridor toward the elevator. Her phone was already in her hand. She opened the recent calls and looked at the DC number. And then she looked at the other number, the Colorado Springs area code she hadn't called in 2 years, and understood, with the cold clarity that came from having run operations long enough to read the architecture of them, that those 2 numbers were not unconnected, and that somebody had been patient enough to wait until a specific set of circumstances made her the one who would need to dial. She dialed the Colorado Springs number first. It rang 4 times. She was in the elevator, watching the floor numbers change, and she had almost decided to hang up when the line connected, and a voice she hadn't heard in 2 years said her name with the particular warmth of someone who had been waiting without pushing, which was one of the harder things a person could do. "Claire." "You knew," she said. Not angry, past angry, into something more direct. You knew where I was. A pause. Yes? How long? Since about 6 months after you left. Another pause. I didn't reach out because you needed the space, and I understood that. But I kept track. Because that's what you do with people you... The voice stopped, reconsidered. I knew where you were. The elevator opened on the ground floor. She stepped out and moved to a quiet corner near the stairwell, out of the foot traffic. Trace, she said. She called me 3 weeks ago, the voice said. She told me she had an asset that needed extraction from a field environment, and that she thought you might be the right resource if the situation developed correctly. A pause. I told her I wouldn't be part of anything coercive. She didn't need coercive, she needed circumstances. Yes, that's what she does. The voice was quiet for a moment. Claire, I want you to understand that I did not set this up. I told Trace where you were because she asked and because I trusted her intentions. Whether that trust was fully warranted that's a conversation I'll have with her separately. Claire leaned against the stairwell wall. The hospital hummed around her, its ordinary business proceeding on all sides. She was right, though, Claire said finally. Trace, the circumstances. She looked at the far wall. I couldn't have stayed invisible much longer. Margaret was going to move on me eventually regardless. I was asking too many questions. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. And that was true, which felt different from the last 2 years of knowing very precisely what she was doing and choosing it deliberately. Not knowing had its own quality, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Whatever you decide, the voice said. I'm here. I've been here. She said nothing for a moment, then, I know, Marcus. She ended the call and stood in the corner by the stairwell while the hospital moved around her, and she thought about the 2 years she'd spent trying to become someone who didn't take up much space, and how that effort had been, in the end, its own kind of violence against herself. You couldn't amputate what you were good at. You could only ignore it until it found its way back through whatever door you'd left open. The Department of Health's regulatory review of Margaret Holt took 11 days. Claire wasn't present for most of it. She was reinstated on day 3, back on the floor, and the work of returning was its own complex thing. The looks from staff that ranged from relief to uncertainty to the guarded recalibration of people who had watched the power structure shift and weren't sure yet what replaced it. She didn't address any of it directly. She showed up, she did the work, she gave handoffs so thorough and specific that the oncoming nurses started arriving 10 minutes early because they'd learned that what Claire Donovan told you in handoff was worth getting there early for. Tomas stopped by her workstation on her second day back with coffee, hot this time, correctly timed, and set it down without ceremony. Different in here, he said. How so? He thought about it. Like when the pressure drops before a storm and everything gets, I don't know, clearer. She looked at him. How's Sarah doing? Better. She's sleeping more. Margaret used to schedule her 6 days in a row and then act like it was a scheduling constraint. He paused. It wasn't a constraint. She did it on purpose. I know. Did you know when it was happening? I suspected. She looked at the workstation, the familiar surface of it. I should have done more than suspect. He absorbed that. He'd expected something more exculpatory, she could tell, and the fact that she hadn't given him one seemed to sit with him in a way that was useful. Good nurses needed to learn to sit with that particular discomfort, the gap between what you saw and what you did about it, the accounting you'd do later. She drank the coffee and pulled the first chart of the night. The regulatory findings were released on a Tuesday morning, and Claire was on shift when Gordon Sievers forwarded them to her phone with a single-line message. Read when you have a minute. It's complete. She read them on her break, in the same break room where she'd found Sarah Yamaoka with her hands flat on the table and something close to breaking in her face. She sat in the same chair, with the same view of the same wall, and read the Department of Health's formal findings against Margaret Holt. The document was 14 pages. The findings covered the recorded instruction during the federally monitored resuscitation. That alone was enough for a formal violation, and the language the department used was not bureaucratic softening. It named the instruction, Name the timestamp. Name the patient's physiological status at the moment it was given, and concluded in plain language that the instruction had prioritized institutional hierarchy over patient welfare in a manner inconsistent with the duties of a licensed supervising nurse. It also covered the predetermined disciplinary documentation, the 1:58 a.m. timestamp, the manufactured sequence, the pattern of what the department called retaliatory assignment practices against personnel who had raised staffing concerns. That section was longer. It had been built from payroll records, shift logs, and statements that Claire recognized from the level of detail as having come from multiple members of the floor staff who'd been interviewed without her knowledge. People had talked, people she hadn't asked and hadn't expected. Sarah had talked. Tomas had talked. A nurse named Daria, who worked the swing shift and had never once spoken to Claire directly, had submitted a 3-page written statement about what she'd observed over 4 years of working under Margaret's management. The floor had been watching, all of it, the whole time. They'd filed it away in the specific, careful way that people stored things they didn't yet have the conditions to act on. The department's findings resulted in the suspension of Margaret Holt's supervisory nursing license, pending a formal disciplinary hearing at which she could present her case. The preliminary recommendation was revocation, not suspension, not probation. Revocation. Claire put her phone face down on the break room table and looked at the wall. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. Not satisfaction. Or not only satisfaction, which would have been too clean for what this actually was. What she felt was closer to the exhausted recognition of a thing being named correctly after a long time of watching it exist without its name. Margaret had been hurting people for 15 years in a building full of people who were supposed to prevent that, and the systems had not caught it. And then a federal camera had been in the room one night and caught it in 11 seconds of audio. That was not justice operating the way it was supposed to. That was justice operating the way it actually did. Late, contingent, dependent on a specific set of circumstances that most people never got. She thought about all the nurses who'd come through Margaret's floor before her and hadn't had a federal record land on the right desk at the right time. She picked up her phone, went back to the floor. There were patients. Kyle Reeves appeared at her workstation at the end of his shift that same Tuesday, in the specific tentative way he'd developed since the board proceeding. Not the old approach, the air announcement voice and the talking through her, but something more careful that was still finding its shape. "I heard the department release their findings," he said. "This morning." He stood for a moment. Is it what you expected?" "More or less?" She looked up at him. He'd lost the veneer of effortless confidence in the last 2 weeks, and hadn't yet replaced it with anything solid, which meant he was currently operating on the more uncertain footing of someone who actually knew how much he didn't know. It was worse for him in the short term, better for his patients in the long term. "How are you doing with the new assignment loads?" "Harder," he said, "spread thinner, but—" He stopped. "I'm catching more, without Holt running interference for me. I'm seeing things that I was getting buffered from a lot of things I should have been handling. That's not comfortable." "No." He said it plainly, without dressing it up. "It's not." She nodded. "You'll be better for it." He looked like he believed her, and also like he wished the being better for it was going to take slightly less time. She understood that. Growth in clinical environments had a particular cruelty. It required you to learn from situations where your lack was real, and the consequences of it were borne by people other than yourself. There was no clean way through it. "The board has offered me the director position formally," she said. "I'm still deciding." He seemed surprised that she'd told him. What's the hesitation? She thought about how to answer that honestly. "It changes what the work is. The floor is—" She paused. "The floor is where the actual thing happens, where someone's potassium matters, and someone's scared and you either have the right answer in time or you don't. Administration is a different kind of important. But you'd fix things that hurt people." "I'd try to." She looked at her workstation. "It's not the same as being there." He nodded slowly. He understood that in the particular way that physicians understood it when they were early enough in their careers to still feel the pull of the actual work against the pull of the credentialed authority, that would eventually accumulate around it. For what it's worth, he said, the floor is different with you running it informally. I can feel it. The staff can feel it. He paused. I think you already know what you're going to do. She didn't answer him. He left. She sat with the workstation and the patient list and the particular knowledge that he was probably right. Gita. She called Trace the next morning. She'd spent a day not calling her, which was its own kind of answer to the question of whether she was angry. She was not a hot anger, nothing that needed to be performed, but the steady, cool kind that came from having had something done to her that was well-intentioned and still a violation. She wanted Trace to understand that she understood the architecture of what had been done. She didn't want to pretend she didn't see it clearly. Trace picked up immediately, as she had every time. You ran an operation, Claire said. I was the asset. Yes, Trace said. No deflection, no softening. And Marcus was a resource, not a participant. He told you where you were and didn't know what I intended to do with it. A pause. That was a judgment call on my part. If it cost you something in your relationship with him, I take responsibility for that. Why? Claire asked. Why this way? Why not just contact me? Ask directly. Because you would have said no, Trace said. And you would have meant it. And you would have been wrong. A pause. That's not a justification. I know it isn't, but it's the truth of what I thought. Claire looked at the ceiling of her apartment. Morning light. The quiet that was actual quiet now, not the held breath quiet of the last 2 years. I'm taking the director position, she said. Silence on the line. The ER nursing director role at Hargrove, Claire said. I'm not coming back to the Army. I'm not going back to field work. I'm staying here and I'm going to fix what's broken in this building because this building is where those people end up. The operators, the civilians, all of them. And if the building is broken, then none of the rest of it matters. I know, Trace said. And she did. She heard it in the way Trace said it, the specific acknowledgement of someone who had been counting on exactly this. I'm also going to need you to stay out of my professional decisions going forward, Claire said. No more operations, no more architecture. If you need something from me, you call me directly and you ask. Agreed. And you owe Marcus an explanation. I know that too. A pause that had a different quality from the previous ones. Something more personal in it, less constructed. For what it's worth, Major, I've been doing this for 23 years and I've made harder calls than this one and easier ones. This was not one I made lightly. I know, Claire paused. That's almost what makes it worse. She ended the call. She sat for another few minutes in the quiet apartment. Then she picked up the phone again and called Dr. Harmon's office. I'll take the position, she said when his assistant put her through. But I have conditions and I need them in writing before I sign anything. The conditions were not complicated. She gave them to Harmon in a document that Gordon reviewed and found reasonable, which meant Harmon was going to find them reasonable too, because Gordon had spent 12 years knowing where the lines were. No single nurse to exceed 5 patients on an overnight shift without explicit supervisor authorization and a logged clinical justification. Mandatory rest minimums between back-to-back assignments. A formal reporting pathway for staffing concerns that bypass direct supervisors when the concern involved the supervisor's own assignments. Annual third-party review of assignment patterns across all nursing staff, looking specifically for the kind of concentrated distribution that had been done to her and to others before her. She also asked for one thing that wasn't in the governance document. She asked Harmon to let her be the one to tell the floor staff about the appointment directly, in person, on the floor, before any official announcement went out. He agreed. She did it on a Tuesday evening at the shift change when both the outgoing overnight staff and the incoming evening crew were briefly in the same space, the only time of day when the people who did the actual work were all visible at once. She didn't make a speech. She stood at the nurses' station and told them plainly the conditions, the oversight structure, the reporting pathway. She told them what it was going to look like going forward and what she needed from them and what they could expect from her in return. Sarah Yamaoka was standing near the back of the group. When Claire finished, Sarah looked at her with an expression that had several things in it, And the one that came through clearest was not relief or gratitude, but the specific emotion of someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. Tomas started to say something, probably something she would have found embarrassing, and she cut him off. "There are patients," she said. "Let's work." They did. So, 3 weeks later, Dale Pruitt walked into the Hargrove Memorial ER on a Wednesday afternoon and caused a minor disruption by being a large man in civilian clothes who moved like someone who expected every room to have a threat assessment built into it. The triage nurse called back immediately, and Claire heard it through the station radio and came to the waiting area and found him standing there looking considerably more like himself than the last time she'd seen him, which was in a surgical recovery bed with IV lines, and the particular stillness of someone the pain medication was keeping quiet. He was still moving carefully. His left side was still protecting itself in the way the body protected damage it remembered, even after the damage was addressed. But he was upright, and his color was right, and he looked at her with the expression she remembered from the forward operating base, direct, a little impatient, like he had somewhere to be and this conversation was the necessary thing before he could get there. "You look like you actually slept," he said. "I have a consistent schedule now." She looked him over clinically, which she couldn't help. "How's the chest?" "Surgeon says 8 more weeks before I'm cleared for anything interesting." He made a face that conveyed his opinion of this timeline. "I wanted to stop in before my follow-up appointment. I heard you took the director position." "Word travels. Harwick mentioned it." He paused. "Said the floor's different." "It's 3 weeks in. It's early." He said one of the other nurses filed a complaint through the new reporting pathway, and instead of getting buried, it got addressed within 48 hours. He looked at her. "That's not small." It wasn't. She knew it wasn't. The first test of a new system was whether it worked the first time someone tried to use it, and it had. And she was still carrying the particular weight of knowing that it had taken this long to build that pathway in a building that had been standing for 30 years. "There are things I still need to fix," she said. "I've got a list." "I bet it's a long list." "It's a very long list." He nodded. Around them, the ER moved in its ordinary register. A family at triage, a paramedic relay at the bay entrance, 2 nurses crossing in the corridor with the quick, purposeful gait of people who had somewhere specific to be. The building at work. The building that was supposed to work. "I owe you," Pruitt said. "You don't." "I do. Don't." He stopped. "Let me have this one. I've been lying in a hospital bed for 3 weeks thinking about that night and the storage shed and all of it, and I'm a person who pays his debts, so I owe you. And I'm glad you were there, both times." She looked at him, thought about the storage shed, the 2 hours, the rotors, thought about a trauma bay at 2 in the morning and a needle and a number that climbed from 74 to 91 while the room watched. "Get your follow-up," she said. "And don't argue with your surgeon about the timeline." He smiled at that, a real one, not the managed expression he'd had in the recovery room. "Yes, ma'am." He turned toward the corridor. She watched him go, the careful set of his shoulders, the guarded left side. Then he stopped and turned back, and what he said to the whole space between them, and not quietly. "For the record," he said, "best trauma specialist I ever worked with. Then and now. Just different room." The triage nurse looked up. The paramedic at the bay entrance looked up. Tomas, who was behind the station, looked up. Claire looked at Pruitt. "Go," she said. He went. She stood for a moment in the middle of the ER. Her ER now, 3 weeks into a long list of things that needed fixing, in a building that had spent decades allowing the wrong people to hold authority over the right ones. She was 33 years old and tired in ways that were honest and awake, in ways that were new, and she had a floor to run and a staffing review to finish, and a meeting at 7 with Gordon about the formal appeals process for the nurses who'd been assigned in violation of protocol under the old regime. The work was not going to be clean. It was not going to be fast. People who had spent years learning to function within a broken system did not immediately reorganize when the system changed. They moved carefully, watched to see if the change was real, tested it and pulled back and tested it again. Trust in institutions was built in very small increments by people who showed up consistently and did what they said and didn't disappear when it got complicated. She understood that. She was built for that. She went back to the station, picked up the next chart. There is something worth saying about what happened at Hargrove Memorial in that October. Not as a story about one person's vindication, because that framing makes it too small. The vindication was real, but vindicating one nurse didn't automatically protect the next one. The real work was the structure that came after. The oversight, the reporting pathway, the changed conditions, the thing that made it matter beyond the night it happened. People like Margaret Holt don't survive because they're hidden. They survive because the systems around them don't ask the right questions, and nobody builds the mechanism for the people who see the answers to get them to the people who can act on them. She survives because the person she's been doing it to is tired or isolated or has decided, or reasonably, given the available evidence, that speaking up will cost them more than staying quiet. Claire Donovan spent 2 years staying quiet, and she was not wrong to be strategic about it. She was not weak for surviving the way she survived, but she also knew, in the way that people who have operated in actual danger know, that survival is not the same as living, and invisibility is not the same as safety, and the version of yourself that you hollow out to get through a difficult environment is not the version of yourself that does the most good. The night a dying soldier looked across a crowded trauma room and found her face, he wasn't saving her. He was just the specific set of circumstances that made it impossible to keep pretending she wasn't there. She had always been there. That's the thing that nobody who was ever dismissed, diminished, underestimated, or pushed to the edges of a room should have to learn the hard way, but most of us do. You were never invisible. The people who needed you not to be seen worked very hard to make you think you were. There's a difference between those two things, and understanding the difference is where everything starts. The floor runs differently now, not perfectly. Nothing runs perfectly, and anyone who promises you perfect is selling something. There are still hard nights and short staff and situations where the right answer and the available resources don't match, and you do the best you can with what you have. But the weight is distributed more honestly, and when someone sees something wrong, there's a path for it, and the path goes somewhere. That's not everything. It's also not nothing. It's what she had. It's what she built. It was enough to start.